Happy Epoxy Extravaganza, again. Happy Thursday. Horribly cold outside today. Great day to be in the shop. And especially, when you're going to do epoxy, you have to turn the heat up a little bit. So it's a really nice day to be in the shop compared to how it is outside. This is kind of part one of a bunch of epoxy stuff that we've got going on today. So I want to talk about the big picture. At this session, I am going to show you how to do an epoxy accent like this. And I'll answer whatever questions I can now. What's very cool is that at 4 o'clock Central Time today, we're going to do a Q&A with Kristen Brown, my friend from Total Boat, and she knows epoxy in and out. So if you have other epoxy questions that, especially anything I can't answer now, come back at 4 o'clock and ask Kristen those questions. And we've got a giveaway. So if you have not yet entered the sweepstakes in order to get your chance to win some Total Boat epoxy, you need to do that. And there's a link. Jess is running behind the scenes today and keep making sure, I stay on task. And she's got that, she'll put that link up for you so that you can get in the sweepstakes for your chance to win the epoxy. And we've done a lot of epoxy content. So we've got all sorts of stuff. There's work we did with Jess Crow. We've got articles, we've got videos. So as part of that entering for the epoxy, you're also going to receive a bundle of stuff to teach you about using epoxy. So this is a multifaceted thing. Ahora, we're going to do the epoxy accent. 4 o'clock, we're going to do the Q&A with Kristen. We've got the sweepstakes for you to enter and the bundle of epoxy collated content that you can get when you enter for the sweepstakes. What I'm going to do is there are a number of questions posted already. So before I jump into today's topic, I'm going to answer the stuff that people had posted previously just to get caught up, because I know that I don't want to get distracted more than I typically am. So William says, are there better choices of wood that will ensure the epoxy will adhere better? I worry that over time it'll come apart. So I have done what we're about to do, this epoxy accent. I have done that on a bunch of different species, including a bunch of different hardwoods. The one I'm going to work on today is ash. And the reason I'm pointing out that it's on hardwoods is typically hardwoods are more close-grained than softwoods. So if there's any place that one might worry about a bond, it would be on a hardwood instead of a softwood. And I have never had, you might look at this and feel like, well, if I really work my fingernails under there, if I had fingernails, that I could peel that layer of plastic off, and you can't. It embeds right into the grain of the wood. Part of what makes that happen, the epoxy, of course, is going on to raw wood that gives it the opportunity to bond, just like wood glue that you use all the time bonds by having some porosity to the wood. So I wouldn't worry about selecting a species in order to ensure a bond. And that's a question we can check with Kristen as well later at 4 o'clock. But in my experience, I'm not limiting my material choices based on adhesion. It has stuck to everything I've ever put it on, including like my hands if I forget to wear gloves. Smiley asks, how do you calculate the amount of epoxy needed to cover a certain area? So I saw this question earlier. I put a link on for a video that I did. The bottom line, the short version of this is we're going to calculate, what you can do is calculate volume in cubic inches. And then there's a conversion that lets you change that to ounces. So in this case, I would measure how much of this board do I want to cover with epoxy. And again, get that in cubic inches, change that to ounces, and then that's how much I mix. If you're doing, like if you're filling a void, which is what I do in that video, Then you've got, maybe a pocket, a knot hole, a crack in a board, same thing. Measure the size of that, calculate the volume in inches, cubic inches, and then there's a conversion factor I give you that allows you to change it into ounces. Joy says, I love videos, but I'm better with hands-on. Do you have any in-person classes? So I do. In woodworking in general, I do classes here in my shop. So the hot buttons are cabinet making, bowl turning, epoxy, CNC. If you look, it's just my name, georgevondriska.com is where that schedule is. If you're specifically talking about epoxy, there's an epoxy class coming up in February. I think it's the 1st. But anyway, if you look on there, then you can see what the upcoming schedule is. And then Jess has put into the comments for us as well. There's a Total Boat has provided a discount code. So we've got the sweepstakes. Don't miss that chance. Make sure that you register for the sweepstakes for a chance to get free epoxy. If you're going to buy epoxy, there's a discount code. It's shown in the comments. It's GV Wood, and that'll get you 15% off of Total Boat products through the end of the month. And then Jess has got the link there for the sweepstakes. Barney says, I recently poured an epoxy cutting board. It scratches easily and doesn't hold up well in the dishwasher. Are there better epoxies for cutting boards? So this is a great question. And I think it's an epoxy misnomer, misuse maybe, that happens a lot, which is when you look at how I'm doing this, on this cutting board, I've only poured epoxy here. This is all still wood that's going to get a food safe oil on it. This will be food safe. This is not. Again, epoxy is liquid plastic, basically. So when we pour this on here and then slice on it, two things, you're going to leave slice marks in there. And then also potentially you're freeing little bits of plastic that are maybe migrating into your food. So again, we'll double check this with Kristen later, but as far as I know, most epoxies are not considered FDA food safe. So this is a food surface, this is not. On this, which will be a charcuterie board, whomever I give this to, I'll tell them, you've got this little accent on this end. Don't put a piece of cheese unwrapped on the epoxy. You can put it here where there will be food safe finish, but not on the epoxy. And then just in general with the cutting board, I would tell people never put a cutting board in a dishwasher. High heat, high humidity, obviously, because we're dishwashing it. That's just not going to be good for that. So you gotta be really careful. And I know a lot of people market stuff this way, which is they're showing, maybe they made like a kind of a river table out of a cutting board. I don't consider the epoxy center of that to be food safe or cut safe, because you're definitely gonna leave knife marks in that epoxy. Okay, let's talk about what's gonna happen here. What I'm gonna do, again, I'm gonna kind of replicate what happened here, which is I'm gonna do an epoxy accent on the end of this. And what I like about this is it's just cool looking. It's a really neat way to add a unique touch to whatever it is that you're working on. It could be a cutting board or a cheese board, a charcuterie board. It could be the corner of a desk that you built. It's just a fun way to add a way different color than walnut stain or cherry stain or something like that. In order to do this, I'm going to make a big deal a bunch of times now and at 4 o'clock about making sure you're using the right product. I'm going to do this with what we would call a form of tabletop epoxy. So let me pop cameras for you here. This is called Total Boat Maker Epoxy, and it's in broad strokes. It's a form of what we would call tabletop. This is very specifically made to go on in layers about 1/8 to 1/4 inch thick. Read the directions. Did I mention read the directions? You should read the directions. And the reason I'm harping on that, when I teach epoxy, I always make a big deal out of that because you got to make sure you're using the right product for what you're doing. Tabletop is very specifically designed to go on in thin layers. Casting or thick set epoxy is a product that can be poured in thicker layers. So if you try to do this, if you try to do a river table in a 2-inch thick slab with tabletop, it's going to go really badly, really fast. So you really got to read the directions and make sure you're understanding the product and what it's capable of. And or call the company and say, this is what I want to do. Which of your products is the best choice for this? The other thing that's very specific is the manner in which it's mixed. And this isn't Total Boat, this isn't Maker Epoxy or Tabletop, this is all epoxy. You want to use specifically a mixing cup for this. And when it mixes 1-to-1, and that's what this does, 50% this one, 50% this one, you don't spitball that by pouring it in a Dixie cup. You pour it into a mixing cup, which is calibrated, and you can very specifically see if I have 2 ounces of resin, I need 2 ounces of hardener. So you want to make sure that you're doing the mixing correctly. Environmentally, when I started this and I was joking about, baby, it's cold outside, which it is, but it's really warm in my shop today. Normally I keep my shop about 62 degrees. Today it's more like 72 degrees because I'm working with epoxy. So there's an optimal window where epoxy performs well. And again, if you read the directions, it'll say, the manufacturer will tell you where they would like your shop environment to be when you're going to do this. So we've got a couple things going on. For the work I'm doing here, for this accent, a tabletop form is what we need. This stuff is sourced for you in the description of the live stream, this particular product. Be very specific with your mixing. If it's 1-to-1, it's got to be 1-to-1. If it's 1-to-1 volume, you can do it in a mixing cup. If it's 1-to-1 by weight, you have to do it on a scale. Read the directions, it'll tell you which one it is. And then make sure your environment is set. If this wood just came in from my garage where it's 15 degrees right now, I can't put epoxy on it. The material, the epoxy, your environment, all has to be at the right temperature for this to perform well. Okay, those are kind of the admonishments to make sure you're doing this right. I'm going to go ahead and glove up. You definitely want to have rubber gloves on for this because it can be a little bit messy and it's easier to peel the glove off later. It's a little small for my hand than it is to get the epoxy off later. That being said, this is a spritz bottle of denatured alcohol. While epoxy is wet, so before it cures, denatured alcohol is the solvent for epoxy. So you want to have some of that on hand. Like if I had a little spill here that I needed to clean up, or I just got epoxy someplace it shouldn't be, then you want to have some denatured alcohol on hand to take care of that. What I did before you got here is I put I put the resin in that cup. I don't have any hardener in it yet. So the reason for that being, if I'd already mixed it and I was standing here blabbering away, that would get away from me. It would start to cure. So I calculated how much I need. I've got a little bit of epoxy in the cup. I'm going to add the other portion of epoxy. And then while I'm mixing, I'm going to talk some more. Little hint, make sure you put this lid back on this. Don't take both lids off at the same time and then mix them up. because if the resin lid has a little resin on it and you put it on the hardener bottle, you just epoxied the lid onto the bottle. So when you mix, don't rush this. So I'm not beating eggs. I'm gently mixing these two together. What I'm trying to avoid is getting a bunch of air bubbles in here. We're going to deal with air bubbles if we have them, but it's best to avoid them if we can. You need to mix. Generally, companies recommend about 3 minutes of mixing to make sure that the whole, part A and part B are thoroughly mixed together. So while I'm mixing, if you look at the board, you can see it's up off the mat. This is specifically a mat that epoxy won't stick to. I'm going to get drips. So I don't care if they drip on that because I can peel them off later. It's up off the mat because I know I'm going to get drips. So I want that clearance between the bottom of whatever I'm working on and the work surface so that I can allow it to drip. I've got Dixie cups. Those disposable cups are what I'm going to mix color in. And I'll talk about color next. So these are all pigment. And there's 3 more colors over there. There's a bazillion colors of pigment. With pigment, when you mix it in, you're going to get a solid color. If I use red, I just have red. I'm going to contrast that with mica powder. When you use mica powder, that's what gives you kind of a pearlescence to it. When I can take my hands off of mixing this, I'll show you on this other board the contrast between the two. So it's nice to have both, and you can mix them together. So with the pigment, and it's incredibly concentrated, a very small portion of pigment is going to give you, like I said, if we just use red, it's going to give me red epoxy. And you don't have to mix color in, you can leave it clear if you want. If I then add a mica powder to the red, it's going to introduce some stripes, some pearlescence to that gives it, that's where I think we get some pretty cool effects. I'm not scientific about it. In other words, I'm not looking at in so many ounces of epoxy, I'm adding so many micro ounces of pigment or mica powder. I'm just doing it by eye as I go. On this one, I believe what I'm going to do on this end is some green and some blue. No. I'll see how my mood takes me here. But the reason I'm doing this the way I'm doing, it's easier. I'm mixing the total volume of required epoxy here, and then I'm going to add it. Then I'm going to pour it into the Dixie cups rather than try to do a mix and a mix and a mix and a mix and a mix in the cups and then add the color to those individual cups. In a second here, I'm going to pour this out. And if you need 4 colors, then you pour out 4 cups. The other thing you're going to want to have handy before you start doing this is a heat gun. And that's how we're going to deal with bubbles. And it also acts as kind of a paintbrush that's going to let you flow the epoxy around and help it flow. So I'm going to do, I think I'm probably about okay there. Now I got to be cognizant of not letting that get away from me. But I want to look quickly for questions. Okay. Thomas says, did you learn that tip the hard way? I don't know which particular tip that is, but yeah, I mean, I was very lucky. Jess Crow was here doing videos for WWGOA a bunch of years ago. She's forgotten more about epoxy probably than I'll ever know. So I learned a lot from her. Blow in the gloves before you put them on. Pro tip. Yes, I should have done that. Will the use of vacuum degassing for bubbles remove removal will be discussed today or in a later live stream. I'm not going to talk about it now. I've done videos on vacuum pots. I don't know, Jess, if you can look for that and put the link on here. But I wouldn't do that for a tabletop like this. I would do it for a casting. And we covered that from in that video. David, can you mix mica powder and pigment? Yes. I use pigment drops. A few months later, it literally disappear. Any suggestions? Bad product. I don't know how it could disappear. I've never had that happen where I pigment an epoxy and then the color goes away. I don't know how that could happen. Tom says, how can I prevent dye from migrating through end grain and dyeing what I don't want? You need to, penetrating epoxy is the answer to that. So shellac can also work because I've done that. But if you've got an area, let's say you've got a pocket and you're about to fill the pocket with blue epoxy and you don't want it leaching out into the maple, then penetrating epoxy or shellac, de-waxed shellac first to seal that, then do the epoxy, then do the tinted epoxy. What is the working time for this epoxy? 20 minutes-ish, maybe. Should the wood be sealed prior to epoxy applying? I'm trying to go fast and I'm going too fast. My tongue is getting whatever that is stuck on my eye teeth and I can't see what I'm saying. Should the wood be sealed prior to applying epoxy? No. We're going to go right onto the raw wood. Okay. I'm going to dispense, I don't know, a few cupfuls here. And this is very just, you know, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I'm going to do, like I said, some blue, some green. I like to just leave a little clear in case I got to add that to something later. And then I'm going to do some of this just because I don't know what that's going to be yet. And you can see why I have this work mat down. I'm already spilling epoxy on it. So I'll tell you what, if you think epoxy can be a little bit frenetic, try doing it live. That's green. So I am going to, let's see, I think I'm going to switch cameras and get you in tight now for all the mixing stuff. There is where's my camera? There's that pigment, very, very thick. For the volume we're talking about here in that little Dixie cup, it's going to take very little of that pigment to give me color. And my preferred method is dip the stick, get a little bit on the stick, and then mix it in rather than try to pour that into here. I have way better control, I think, if I put a little bit on the stick. So I've got green. It's a little bit translucent. I want to go a little bit darker. So of course I can't put that in the pigment. I think that's going to do it. And then second verse, same as the first. I'm going to grab some blue. This is where if I had a shop assistant, they could be reading me questions while I'm doing the boring mixing part. Now, let me talk about that board a little bit. If you look at it closely, there's an aggressive roundover right there, and that's on purpose. It's because I want the epoxy to waterfall over that edge. So if I just leave that square, it can't waterfall over the edge. And then let's do, in the epoxy or the mica powder world, I think what I'm going to do, there's some blue, and that'll complement the blue. And I'm going to do this as a standalone. Like I said, you can mix this with the pigment if you want to. While I'm mixing, and again, I like to put it on the stick, put it in, get it on the stick, put it in, rather than try to pour, because I don't want that powder, I don't want a cup of it in there. I want just a few smidgens of it. Whilst I'm mixing, if you missed it at the beginning, a lot going on today related to epoxy. At 4 o'clock, Kristen Brown from Total Boat is going to be with me for Q&A. If you have any other epoxy questions, bring them at 4 o'clock. She is an expert, and she is going to be able to answer those questions. We've got a sweepstakes going. We're giving away Total Boat product. So Jess is great about putting the link for the sweepstakes in the chat roll. So you can look at that, click the link. Not only is that going to enter you for the chance to win epoxy, but there's a epoxy bundle of stuff, work that we've done, content we've created that you can get, that you're going to get when you go to that link. So that's going to help you learn how to work with epoxy. Then additionally, Total Boat has provided a discount code, and that'll get you 15% off anything that you want to buy. And that is GV, my initials, GV Wood. And you use that at the Total Boat site, and that'll get you a discount. So I think I'm not going to answer questions now. I'll catch up after I do this, but I want to get this pouring started. So I think I'm going to do blue, and then my blue mica powder, and then my green. Now, one of the things, remember I said, I want this to waterfall over the edge. So part of kind of the chemistry, the physics of this, is that this liquid doesn't necessarily want to waterfall over unless I kind of break the surface tension. Another good reason to have gloves on. So by doing this, I'm going to encourage it to go in that direction. Then let's try some mica powder, and hopefully here you can see the contrast. The mica powder mix has a whole different look than the pigment mix. And again, remember, for me, because of food safeness, I only want to hit a little bit. I want to just accent the end of this board so that I have a food safe area over here. So I don't want to get a boatload of epoxy on there. Now I'm going to grab the heat gun. I'm going to do a little preliminary. It's popping the bubbles. It's also flowing the epoxy over that edge. I'm using the airflow like a brush to help push the epoxy over. Now at this second, it's got a pretty cool look, not an amazing look. I'm going to readjust the camera. Probably get epoxy on the camera. But that'll help you see the pattern a little bit better. So the other thing, remember I used my finger to break the surface tension. You can also use your finger like a paintbrush and do a little of that. And I like doing that to blend stuff together a little bit. Now that's looking pretty smurferific. I'm going to get a little more color going. So I said earlier, this is very beauty, eye of the beholder stuff. It's very subjective. Another question I know people ask a lot is, I do this, and then what do I do to get it shiny and cool looking? And the answer is to that is you just pour the epoxy. There's no next step after this is poured and cured to make it shiny. When this cures out, we'll go back to that other board and I'll show you. When this cures, it will be flat and shiny. So again, I'm popping the bubbles, but I'm also using that like an airbrush, paintbrush kind of a thing to help flow the epoxy over the edge. And with these touches, what I'm doing is making sure there was a little raw wood spot right there. I'm making sure that's covered. I like that. I got to add a little to this edge that you can't see, but trust me, I got to add a little. Then I think it's going to take another heat gun to flow everything. I like the mica powder a lot. And obviously, I use pigment and mica powder. Pigment to get color, but mica powder to really get that. I keep using that word pearlescence over and over and over. But that's the gee whiz part of it, is getting that really cool look that the mica powder adds. There we go. So if you're posting questions, I'm going to get to them in a sec. As you're probably aware, once I'm starting with the epoxy, I got to kind of take that to its end point. Heat gun sounds like it's about ready to die. And so you see me doing this, don't overly blast it with the heat gun because you can scorch the epoxy. And we don't want scorch, we just want bubbles gone. Now what I'm doing, I've got a little finger grip under here that I did with a router bit. So I'm going to pull through that. I want to make sure that's all consistently. I'm not leaving raw wood in that finger grip. And that's just an aesthetic. There would be nothing wrong with raw wood being down there. But I just want the aesthetic of that being also covered with epoxy. I like that. I just got to double check before I take my gloves off. But I've got another pair I can throw a glove back on if I need to. All right, let's come back to, woo! That was fun. This is a very small pour I mentioned earlier. It's up on painter's pyramids to get it up off the mat. If you're doing something big as a tabletop, or really any epoxy pour. Epoxy is just like water, it's self-leveling. So if this was a larger surface, I'd make sure this is sitting here perfectly level so the epoxy can't all flow off of one end. Let's see what you got here. So again, while I'm loading here, sweepstakes, there's a link for that. Going to that link, in addition to entering the sweepstakes, is going to get you the bundle of stuff about working with epoxy that we've put together for you. Also, discount code GVWOOD used at Total Boat to get a 15% discount on stuff. Also, at 4 o'clock, Kristen from Total Boat will be with us, not here. They're in Rhode Island. She will be with us to answer any more in-depth questions that you have about epoxy. All right, so we got, should the wood be sealed? For the person who asked, great find on the pressure pot, Jess. The person who asked about removing bubbles, and I think their question was vacuum chamber. I do it with a pressure pot, not with a vacuum chamber. The reason I did that, the reason I chose a pressure pot is my feeling is kind of everybody owns an air compressor and can pressurize. Not everybody owns a vacuum pump and can create a vacuum. So that felt like a more accessible approach to using a chamber to get rid of bubbles. But Jess has got that link in the chat room. Doug says, need for PPE. So gloves, goggles, airflow. If you're concerned about the airflow, put on a VOC mask. So not a dust mask, the mask you would wear if you were spray and finish. Splintered finger, there's no way to go lighter once the pigment is added. Correct. Well, you could dilute it with more clear. So that's a great question. When I did my 4 cups, I knew I was going to do a blue and a green and a mica. And then this has still got clear in it. So if I added so much pigment there, it kind of got away from me and was too green, I could go back and add clear to reduce it. But there's no, other than diluting it with clear, there's no way to back off on that color. And then Jess has got the link there also in the chat roll for the drawing, the sweepstakes. Thomas says, can I use a power mixer or mix by hand? So you can. If I'm doing a big volume, like for what I'm doing here, I'm going to mix it with a popsicle stick. If I'm doing a large volume, I'm going to power mix it. But again, we're not mixing a cake. So you can use a power mixer and a cordless drill, slow RPM. If you're going to mix it really fast, and you're going to have 11 billion air bubbles in that epoxy. And yes, a heat gun will remove air bubbles, but not if you have 11 billion. So a power mixer is a great way to go. And if you get one, mine is sitting on a shelf way over there. If you get one that's got the rubber beaters on it, you can just let the epoxy dry on there. After it cures, when you bend the beaters, the epoxy will crack off and you're ready to go again for next time. So like I said, denatured alcohol will clean wet epoxy, but with the beater, if it's bendable, you don't have to worry about cleaning it because you can just break the epoxy off later. Ron, how long does epoxy take to cure? So I'm not being sarcastic, Ron, but I'm going to say, read the directions. In this case, tabletop epoxy, we've got all these drips on the bottom, and I intentionally left them on this one for you. So this is what that's going to look like. You want to let this sit for about 3 days. And then with a random orbit sander, you can sand those off. Different epoxies are different on cure time. A deep pour, like you might use for a casting or a river table, those can take 7 days to dry. to cure. So you gotta make sure you understand the working properties of whichever particular product you're using for that project. And remember, and like I said, you gotta match the product to what you're trying to do. So don't look at tabletop and say, well, I'm going to do my river table with tabletop because it cures faster. I'm going to show you at 4 o'clock what happens. It's pretty exciting if you mix tabletop and pour it thick. It's a very interesting science experiment. It's not good. David says, did you use heat on the heat gun or just ambient air? No, so yeah, the heat is on. I'm running, I'm turning it all the way on, whatever the high setting is. And that's where, as I was using it and backing off, using it and backing off, make sure you don't get too much air on it and move the epoxy too much, or get too much heat on it, you can scorch the epoxy. But you want, the heat is what's popping the bubbles. Oh, and what temperature? High. I don't know. I think I could tell you watts if it says readily. But I'm not finding it. So this is the ever famous Wagner 0503655. Whatever high setting is on that model, that's the temperature. Shelf life of epoxy. Boy, there's a great question for Kristen today. You know, in the end, I get it. I use it up, and I'm not really testing the shelf life. I'm going to save that one. Bill, if you can watch at 4 o'clock, we'll make sure we get that question in front of Kristen at 4. With something like, it's nice with these products to be able to get them in smaller bottles so that if you don't think you're going to need a gallon of resin and a gallon of hardener, being able to, for these kind of projects, getting it in these smaller bottles, and again, those are sourced for you in the description, is very convenient to make sure you're using it up. Fox says, I see you're comfortable leaving the lids off the mica powder while working. I assume it doesn't dry out. Oh, so the pigment. This is the mica powder, and then these are the pigment. So yeah, for me, for the whatever, you know, I'm looking at a clock, the half hour it's been since I opened those, I'm not worried about that. It's not the pigment is pigment. That's repetitively redundant. The pigment is just pigment. There's no dryer in there. So the cure from the epoxy, the cure that's happening now is from the epoxy. It has nothing to do with the pigment. So I don't think I would want to leave the lids open forever. But having them off in the working time it takes me to do this, and then I'm going to button everything up and clean up when you're gone, that's fine. It's not like a little thing of paint. Cameron says, could you use a drum sander to sand the drips? Well, sort of yes, sort of no. So the problem would be we've added a little bit of epoxy on this side. So right now, this end of the board is going to end up, I don't know, an 1/8 inch thicker than this end of the board. If I send it through a drum sander, am I going to get a little bit of unevenness as a result? So I've never done it. When I'm doing the drips, it's a couple minutes with a random orbit, just concentrating on that end, and then I'm done. Jim says, I love your musical references, but you're showing your age. By the way, I'm older than you. Yes, I think I'm pretty good at showing my age with my references. Smiley says, I'd like to make a suggestion, that is eliminate the drips and the trouble to remove them. Line the bottom edges with tape, and then you can peel it off when you're done. I've used it and it works. So that's a good approach. And I'm pretty sure I have a video of Jess Crow's where she shows that. My problem, this is a George thing, is if you don't get to the tape. So this epoxy is going to go through a cure cycle. And right now it's like honey. on there. In a little while, it's going to be kind of rubbery. And then eventually it's going to be rock hard. You got to peel the tape at that rubbery step. The heat gun can help you with that. If you miss it, then you're still sanding off drips and masking tape. So for me, because I get very distracted and I'm going to forget to come back and peel the tape off, I know this about myself, I don't bother. I let it fully cure and then I just sand it off later. But Smiley is right. The masking tape trick really does work. All right. I'll tap dance for a minute just to see if there are any other preguntas, any other questions. But again, I'm a broken record here. There's another age reference. Someday young people will say, broken record. What do you mean? I will briefly tell a funny story. My sister, who's a little younger than I, was saying to a group, she would love to one day own a record store. And a young person in the group said, what do you mean? Well, people would bring in their old records and I would sell them. And then, you could like trade records. And the young person said, well, why would I want somebody else's records? Well, because old records are cool. And then, you buy. So the disconnect was the young person heard this as like my medical charts are at my sister's store. My tax records are at my sister's store and somebody's going to buy them. She had no reference to this black thing with a hole in the middle is a record. So, okay, I sound like a broken record, but 4 o'clock today, be here or be square. Kristen Brown, Total Boat, expert on epoxy. She will be able to answer stuff that I did not answer today. Additionally, Jess has been great about putting up the link for the sweepstakes. That's going to get you in the drawing for the Total Boat product, and it's going to get you a bundle of epoxy related stuff that we've done to help you learn about epoxy. And Total Boat has provided a discount code, 15% off if you use GV Wood. It's in the chat roll. You can look at it there. That's on the Total Boat site that you're going to apply that if you're buying Total Boat products. Okay. Throughout that tap dance, no other questions appeared. Do you have any questions? Okay. A live visitor in the shop. So that is it for me for now. Thanks for watching. I will see you at 4 o'clock. We'll take advantage of everything Kristen knows. And I'm also going to show you that cool science experiment, which is if you use if you use tabletop epoxy to do a deep pour, it's going to go really south, really fast, but it's kind of cool to watch. See you at 4 o'clock.